Now, the rest of the story. Even as a little girl, she hated long car rides. Said they made her sick to her tummy. One day she was old enough to drive, and a handyman who worked for her parents taught her how. It was maybe one of the most traumatic things that ever happened in his life and hers. Not only did the little girl dislike driving, she was sometimes afraid behind the wheel, and she was terrible at parking. In fact, her family and friends were amazed that she even got a driver's license. But eventually she did, and the point is that she preferred almost any other kind of transportation. Sailboating was especially fun for her, and she was good at it, too. Didn't have the slightest fear of water, and walking, whenever time permitted, she would travel on foot virtually regardless of the distance. Only when the situation demanded would she go by car, and then only the shortest distances, because long rides still made her car sick. And she always drove as slowly as possible, because speed terrified her. And wouldn't you know, one day, the woman who hated driving married a man who just loved cars. Now, this fellow had been auto racing even long before his marriage. Slick chassis profiles and powerful engines and high speeds had been his passions since boyhood. His tendency to take chances made his interest even more dangerous. Reckless his driving was sometimes called, but the risk was only part of his lifetime fascination with automobiles. He had a huge collection of cars, including about a dozen vintage ones. Most of the old-timers had been purchased in bad condition so that he could have the thrill of restoring them. He owned another dozen cars as well, recent models. Almost all of them were high-powered roadsters and roaring racers. Their sophisticated machinery provided uncountable hours of joyous tinkering, and their power, well, that was the essence of his greatest joy, speed. His friends never quite figured out why a man who so loved automobiles would marry a woman who so detested them. But he did marry her, and you know what? They were so much in love that the main difference between them lost its significance. How they worked things out was he accepted her dislike of long car trips, he accepted her fear of fast driving, and she agreed to tolerate his speed as long as she was not along for the ride. For example, should he wish to make a precipitous hairpin curving dash through the mountains in one of his sports cars, she would simply stay home. Whenever a drive through the mountains was unavoidable, her husband would drive on ahead at his own speed, while she and her car would follow slowly at a comfortable distance. That's pretty much the way it happened that summer day, going on 27 years ago. That's how come she was behind the wheel when her car tumbled over a cliff and off a mountain road. And those closest to her recalled the tragic irony of her lifelong fear of driving, a lifelong fear which she was never able to explain. Grace Kelly, Princess of Monaco. Yes, now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. Grace Kelly was known around the world as America's Princess. Some people believe Grace Kelly had a premonition, a gut feeling about cars. Is it possible that she subconsciously prophesied her own demise? Grace Kelly is certainly one of the most iconic actresses of the golden age of Hollywood. She appeared in films such as Dial M for Murder, Rear Window, To Catch a Thief, which we'll talk about shortly, and her last film, High Society. These four are among my favorite films. In the 6 years she acted in films, she appeared in 30 productions. In April 1955, Grace headed the U.S. delegation at the Cannes Film Festival. While there, she was invited to a photo session with Prince Rainier III at the Prince's Palace of Monaco. On May 6, 1955, Grace met the Prince and a courtship followed. On April 19, 1956, Grace and the Prince were married. Grace willingly gave up her Hollywood career to settle down with her prince. Did you know there's a conspiracy theory surrounding her death? Let me tell you that the conspiracy theory is completely without merit. Let's take a look at what really happened. On the morning of September 13th, 1982, 52-year-old Grace Kelly and her 17-year-old daughter Stephanie were traveling in their 1971 Rover P6 from the royal family's summer residence in the hills above Monaco to their palace in Monte Carlo overlooking the Mediterranean. But wait a minute, Grace Kelly had a chauffeur. Why wasn't he driving? Where was he? You see, Grace and Stephanie had carefully placed their clothing and hats on the back seat of the car so they wouldn't get wrinkled or disheveled, and there was only room in the car for 2 people. The chauffeur offered to make 2 trips, but Grace said she would go ahead and just drive her and her daughter. The road Grace was driving on was the same one that featured prominently in Alfred Hitchcock's legendary 1955 film To Catch a Thief, starring Cary Grant and Grace Kelly. In the film, Grace drives a rare 1953 Sunbeam Alpine Mark I along the same gorgeous but dangerous road and eludes French police while Cary Grant, riding shotgun, appears to be terrified. White knuckles. As Mr. Harvey pointed out, Grace Kelly was fearful of cars, especially when driven fast. For the film, most of Grace's driving was done on a Paramount soundstage California, using a film trick called rear screen projection. This is why Grace seemed so at ease during the driving scenes. I'll include a link to those driving scenes in the description below. Grace Kelly had complained of headaches in the days leading up to the crash. As they drove over the winding road, Grace had a cerebral hemorrhage, a stroke. A motorist driving behind Gracie's Rover P6 saw the car swerving back and forth on the road, and then the car accelerated to well over 50 miles per hour as they approached the hairpin turn. Stephanie, sitting in the passenger seat, tried to regain control of the car after Gracie's stroke, but was unable to. The car smashed through a stone barrier, tumbled down the mountainside, and burst into flames. 62-year-old Sesto Licchio said, "I heard a very loud noise that sounded like an airplane was about to crash. He looked outside and saw that Princess Grace's car had landed on its top in his garden." The car was on fire. Sesto ran to his truck, grabbed a fire extinguisher, and put out the fire. Sesto and a neighbor pulled Stephanie out of the driver's side door. Sesto was unable to free Grace from the crashed car. Sesto then called the police and the fire department. Once they arrived, firemen broke a back window out of the car and eventually freed Grace, who remained unconscious. Now, there are 2 parts of the conspiracy theory that I should clear up here. The first was the false report that the brakes failed. An investigation following the crash found that her brakes were fully functional, as was the emergency brake. Some websites even go as far as quoting the conversation between Princess Grace and Stephanie when they realized something was wrong. The second was that witnesses who saw Sesto pull Stephanie from the driver's side door assumed she, Stephanie, was driving. 20 years after the crash, Stephanie, then 37 years old, said in an interview, "I was not driving, that's clear. In fact, I was thrown around inside the car like my mother, who was catapulted onto the back seat. The passenger door was completely smashed in. I got out on the only accessible side, the driver's." Grace and Stephanie were transported to the only public hospital in Monaco. Stephanie was treated for her injuries and released. Initial reports said Princess Grace would spend about 10 days in the hospital, but Grace had another, more severe cerebral hemorrhage while in the hospital. 52-year-old Grace Patricia Kelly, the Princess of Monaco, America's princess, died at 10:55 p.m. on the following night, September 14, 1982. Following the death of Princess Grace, the hospital was renamed in honor of her, of Princess Grace. Its name translates in English to the Princess Grace Hospital Center. On September 18, 1982, Over 400 mourners gathered at the Cathedral of Our Lady Immaculate in Monacoville for the private funeral for Grace. Those in attendance included Cary Grant, Nancy Reagan, wife of American President Ronald Reagan, Danielle Mitterrand, wife of French President Francois Mitterrand, Empress Farah of Iran, and Diana, Princess of Wales. Princess Grace was buried in the Grimaldi family vault. Prince Rainier III, Grace's husband, never remarried. When he died in 2005, he was buried right alongside Princess Grace. You know, we never know when our time is up, so let your loved ones know just how much you care for them often, just in case. My grandfather used to tell me to live each day as though it were your last, because one day it will be. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.